Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast, reflecting on the 4 races we've had since the summer break and a brief look ahead to the calm before the storm. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Coop, and the legend that is lead editor, Ian Parks. Gentlemen, legend, it's a fair enough word to use, I think, after some of the videos we've done this year. Gentlemen, we are just about halfway through this unusual autumn break, and we'll start off with quite a staggering stat. I think is a fact. It's not a stat. This time last year, the day we're recording this is, of course, Monday, the 7th of October. This time last year, Max Verstappen had just won the 2023 World Championship. Fast forward to 2024, and here we are, 6 races to go, both championships very much up for grabs. And like I said, it is now kind of the calm before the storm with the final 6 races, Ian.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on this lovely Monday. I just want to point out, by the way, that we've got Nick Golding fresh back from his stag weekend in Barcelona, and Sam Coop not long back. I'll give him, he's had a bit more time from the Oktoberfest weekend. So heaven knows how this might turn out. So forgive them if there are any slip-ups along the way, or obviously these two guys aren't looking at their freshest, but there we go. We shall plough on through. Yeah, good point, Nick. 1 year on exactly that we're recording this from the day Max Verstappen won his 3rd world title. And it was slightly contentious a year ago because he did it over the Qatar Grand Prix weekend, but he did it on Sprint Saturday, not Grand Prix Sunday. So that caused a little bit of there's a bone of contention around that because, we've had all this debate about, surely, world titles should really be won on a Sunday, etc. Well, it is what it is now. Like it or not, Max, we know, certainly doesn't like sprints, that's for sure. The sprints now are here to stay. And lo and behold, he went and won that on a Sprint Saturday and for his 3rd world title. He did that with actually 6 Grand Prix to go, because obviously bear in mind, we'd still had to run the Qatar Grand Prix and there were still 5 other Grand Prix weekends that follow it. So world champion last year with 6 Grand Prix to go. That was some feat as well. And here we are. We have 6 Grand Prix to go. And yes, he might have a relatively healthy 52-point lead in the driver's standings as we speak. But we know that that lead has been eroded to a certain extent by Lando Norris in recent times. McLaren most definitely has the better package going into these 2 final, going into these 2 triple headers to conclude the season. Let's put it that way. So it's still plenty to play for, especially in the Constructors' Championship. Last year, Red Bull won the Constructors' Championship in the race previously. They did it with 7 Grand Prix weekends. So again, 6 full Grand Prix weekends to go. And here we are. They are facing now a 41-point deficit to McLaren because of the complete turnaround in form between McLaren and Red Bull, which I know we're going to discuss a bit more in depth in this podcast episode.
It is remarkable just how much things have changed there, because even if you go back to the start of this season and the way Red Bull and Max came out the starting blocks, yes, okay, they had the technical failure in Australia, but it was remarkable the way they started the season to the point we were kind of thinking they're going to do this again, they're going to cruise to another 2 championships. It's changed dramatically, Sam, and now we have this remarkable title picture, but in not only the constructors, but actually still just about in the drivers as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, you speak to this 180 that's happened in 6 months, and it has been stark, the contrast that we now have from where we were, not only this time last year, but this time in, April, essentially. So, yeah, we've got a really interesting title picture, and the next few rounds, this triple header is going to be key because there are some real unanswered questions going into, especially the United States Grand Prix. We've got this 3-week break, as you've obviously mentioned already, which is very unusual. It's a new thing in F1. It's not a break in the sense of the summer shutdown. Teams are still working, and that is the critical point, is that Red Bull, with the momentum that they started to kind of show in Singapore, albeit 20 seconds down on Lando, Max had a really strong weekend compared to what we kind of had benchmarked him for. How much Red Bull can then take that and run with it up to the round in Austin is going to be really key, because if they are there or thereabouts, they're looking good Max is looking good in the Drivers' Championship with a 52-point advantage. The Constructors is more difficult because they need Sergio firing on all cylinders. And again, I think week by week, we don't quite know what level Perez is going to bring to any given circuit. So that there will be questions undoubtedly remaining in the Constructors. But yeah, it's a big case now of how much they can deliver to salvage that Drivers' Championship. And if they can't, then we could see a kind of a slow burn towards how close can Lando get before the end of the season, and can he be within shot when we get to Abu Dhabi?
And you mentioned there the summer break, which actually was only 4 races ago. It's remarkable that it feels like a long time ago already, yet so much has happened. Things we discussed during the summer of what we thought might happen in the second half of the season. Some have come to fruition, some haven't. And Ian, for you, what do you think is the biggest thing we've learnt over the 4 races between the summer break and this autumn break?
That McLaren has a car for all tracks.
Yeah.
We know full well that McLaren was heavily upgraded for the Miami Grand Prix, and the team, unlike all of its rivals, and even those further down the grid, where they've added packages since then, McLaren has pretty much, for the most part, not touched that package, which I think has been one of the most extraordinary things across the course of this season when you consider how many Grand Prix we've had since Miami. We've seen the Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes in particular, those main rivals I'm talking about, all add updates to upgrades that they had brought previously. They've had various iterations, tried new floors, tried new various aerodynamic parts, and for the most part, they failed to work. Whereas McLaren, as I say, brought this upgrade in Miami, and other than some circuit-specific things, other than some minor tweaks here and there, that car, the Merkel 38, MCL 38, has remained unchanged, and yet it has grown more and more competitive as the season has gone on. That's quite a statement towards McLaren and the work that team has done under Andrea Stella this particular season, that it has now thrust itself into such a position that it is arguably now the favourite to land its first Constructors' title since 1998. 26 years we've had to wait for McLaren to potentially win a Constructors' title. This is as good a shot as it gets for that team. The key now, as Sam alluded to in his previous answer, is what does Red Bull in particular have in its locker, especially as we know there is going to be a significant upgrade on that car for the first race of the final 6, the first of the penultimate triple header, which is the United States Grand Prix in Austin. But for me, that's my main takeaway. The work that McLaren has done on that car, or the lack of it almost, you might well say, since Miami. And yet that car has just stayed so competitive and proven itself around virtually every type of circuit that we've had since then.
Yeah, great. For me, it's consistency is key, because McLaren is the only team that has been performing consistently across every single circuit. And as a result, they have now, overtaken Red Bull in the Constructors and built a bit of a lead. Sam, for you, what do you think has been the biggest thing learned from the 4 races between the summer and now?
I think in some ways, and it's maybe we further learned this, but the Max is fallible. We've over the last few years, with the Red Bull being near invincible as it was last year, save the Singapore Grand Prix, this idea that he can just take anything and adapt to it and, wring it out by the scruff of his neck and get what he needs to from whatever car Red Bull provide him. And what we saw particularly actually in the races where he was closest at the Dutch Grand Prix and in Singapore is that he can't just make miracles happen. And you got a Max on both weekends, FIA, sideshow, to one side, where he was saying, look, I had a really good weekend. This was the best that was on offer. 20 seconds behind Lando was a strong result for me. And it's quite puzzling to see Max like that, because, and it was also quite refreshing because he was always seen as that kind of win at all cost type guy. And now he's matured to a point and he's going, you know what? Second is what's on the table. Why risk it? Why push more than I need to? I'm going to have a considered drive. But I think, yeah, the main point is that he can't just do whatever he wants, whenever he wants in an F1 car and it work. He also needs certain conditions and certain operating windows. And Red Bull, when they can't provide those, he's kind of stuck, and he's ended up in this kind of no man's land between Lando and the rest of the field. So that for me is one of the big take homes, is that, a win isn't on the cards just because he's second or in a podium position. Sometimes that's the best he can do.
But that's the beauty of Formula One. That's the beauty of Formula One at the end of the day. Yes, exactly. We've seen a car and driver so dominant. Started this season and we were all calling it. We were saying, he's going to win it super early again, this fourth driver's title. And it just goes to show that how anything can go wrong for a dominant team at any particular time. And that's exactly what's happened to Red Bull over the course of this season, that it has tried to develop its car, as I was talking about in my previous answer, tried to develop the car, and it just got it wrong. It looked like it was going to, as I say, sail away with this. It had a car in a relatively good place, although obviously we've heard Christian Horner talk previously about the issues with this car going back to last year's RB19, which was quite a surprise. But those issues now have become more and more exacerbated as this season has gone on, despite the fact Max won 4 of the first 5 Grand Prix, the only anomaly there being the one where he sustained a brake issue in Australia and retired. And then he won 7 of 10. Even winning 7 of 10, you think he's still got it in the bag. But here we are, 6 Grand Prix to go, still up for grabs, most definitely in the Constructors' title. I say less so in the Drivers, because Max has got such an edge and there's only 180 points to play for. But yes, we have seen that. I think Red Bull in particular, rather than Max Verstappen, has proven to be more fallible. Max, to me, has still driven the wheels off that car when he's had to. You only had to look at the performance in Singapore. Yeah. Second on the grid, and look where Checo was. Second in the race, look where Checo was. Yes, we know there's a difference between those two drivers. We've talked about this many times in the past. But even so, for me, he's still got the absolute ultimate out of the RB20, which was still 20 seconds behind Lando Norris at the checker flag. But look where his teammate was. Max is still delivering. Red Bull now has to step up to the plate for him to give him that car that he needs over these final 6 Grand Prix if he's going to land that 4th driver's title, and if the team in particular is going to defend its constructor's crown.
Let's continue with Red Bull. We'll go back to McLaren later on, because it's a really interesting point, actually, Sam, that you've raised and Ian, that you've added on, because Red Bull and Max's form yo-yoed over the 4 races between summer and now, and of course ended on a high in Singapore, despite a shocking start to the Singapore Grand Prix on the Friday for Max, where he just looked all at sea at a circuit which Red Bull did not expect to do well at. Yet somehow they've obviously done remarkable changes overnight going into Saturday. Max put his car on the front row and nobody expected that. Finished on the podium. Again, nobody expected that. Yes, 20 seconds behind Lando, but actually, Ian, as you've mentioned, he has such a big lead. Max doesn't need to be winning every single race as long as he's there or thereabouts, even 20 seconds adrift of the winner. If he's in second and Lando can only take so many points away from him, do you think, though, that Singapore, given that Red Bull was not expected to be strong, yet ended up having, arguably, at least in Max's case, the second best package on the grid, do you think with these upgrades coming for Texas that we've slowly started to see a bit of a turnaround in Red Bull's form? Do you think that perhaps they are now starting to understand not only what's caused the problems, but actually know how to fix it as well?
Yeah, I definitely think they got a degree of an idea as to what the issue was. We know, and I've mentioned this on the past, that the issue with the RB20 this year has been a complete disconnect in balance between the front and the rear of the car. That's led to Max suffering various degrees of oversteer, as we've seen in circuits, pretty much almost drifting his way through corners rather than being able to get the car pointed in to that particular corner and coming out of it as sharply as he would like to then accelerate away down to wherever the next straight or corner might be after that. So, yes, that's the general thrust of the problem that they've had with this car. And we were fully expecting in Singapore, and we saw it on the Friday, that the issues that the team encountered in last year's Singapore Grand Prix, where neither Max nor Checo were able to qualify out of Q2 and only managed to salvage a reasonable chunk of points from the Grand Prix itself on Sunday. On this occasion, Friday, it looked like it was going to be almost like a rollover from last year's Singapore Grand Prix. And yet, somehow, some way, Red Bull managed to find something within that car that at least gave Max better performance from it around that kind of circuit where it has always traditionally struggled. The fact he managed to get it second on the grid was phenomenal in my book. Yes, okay, he was second in the race, 20 seconds behind Lando, and that is something that that the team really has to address with its upgrade, because he cannot. You mentioned there he can afford to finish 20 seconds behind Lando every Grand Prix. Actually, he can't, because he's 52 points behind. If he's first and second in those Grand Prix, plus the fastest lap points, and then you've got the points as well, it's going to be super, super tight going into the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. And of course, anything can happen over these 6 Grand Prix. Who knows what might take place? Crash, retirement, anything. So ideally, he needs to win a race from these final 6, in my book, to really help get him over the line. Because just settling for second, well, we know he's never going to settle for second anyway. That's not who Max Verstappen is. Neither is it within Red Bull's mantra, to be honest. That, yeah, we're happy settle for second, and that'll get us what we need. No, they are going to want to win Grand Prix again to prove themselves. In particular, of course, we've discussed this in the past. What comes out of this season predominantly goes into next season, given the changes that we got coming up for 2026. That the car this season is going to be the one for 25. That's the one you're going to have to pretty much battle with, bar a few tweaks, changes, etc. here, there, given the budget cap, etc. So they're going to want to prove that they've got a complete handle on this issue at the United States Grand Prix. They've got one practice session to show it, though. That's going to be fascinating because, of course, the Austin round is, of course, a sprint weekend. And as we know, we only get one free practice session before we then go into sprint qualifying and the sprint and then the Grand Prix.
And the big pressure as well is not only on Max to keep almost outperforming the car to try and get as close as he can to Lando. There's a big pressure on Lando as well, Sam, to be trying to win almost every single race, or at worst finishing second, because he still needs to overhaul a large number of points. 52 points, it is not a small amount with 6 races and of course 3 sprints remaining. But McLaren has been so dominant over the last 4 races. It has won 3 of the last 4 since the summer. 2 wins for Lando, 1 win for Oscar. But actually the thing that's really interesting is we're discussing this potential Red Bull turnaround. You kind of go back in a way to Monza, and I guess one of the big talking points we've had since the summer, and of course papaya rules. Did McLaren get it wrong in Monza? Did they ruin an opportunity for Lando to potentially get even closer to Max? Because yes, 52 points now. Had Monza gone differently and perhaps been managed differently by McLaren, that 52 point deficit could have been nearer 40, potentially even less.
It certainly will be a talking point till the end of the season, much as the Hungarian Grand Prix will remain a talking point. Those moments where you can quite easily turn the points and say, oh, they've lost that there. Those will be things that people will look back on. But ultimately for Lando, and it's a zero-sum game for Lando and for Max, Lando wants that gap, come Abu Dhabi, to be within 26 points. That is what he is aiming for, because anything can happen at a single race. Max can retire early. Lando could be leading, and it could come down to, can I get that fastest lap? Daniel Ricciardo isn't in the car, but Liam Lawson, you wouldn't bet against him going for the fastest lap. So the maths is always going to be key, and that's always going to be drawn back or referred back to. But there's also a wider picture for McLaren. And I think in some ways, I don't know the right way to say this necessarily, but not getting on the wrong side of Oscar, I think, is key. And that makes it sound worse than it is. But Oscar is the key here in the championship. Yeah. Lando needs Oscar to be there in second as a buffer, round after round after round at this stage. Even if it's not for the win, he needs Oscar to be between him and Max to maximise that points deficit at any given round. And you wonder how motivated Oscar would have been had he been, put aside and said, "Look, sorry, mate, you can't have that win. You can't have that second place. You are a number 2 driver for the rest of the season." Yes, Papyrus has come in, and now we know that there are essentially team orders at play for the rest of the season. I mentioned it before that you're going to get an Oscar Piastri who is highly motivated. And we saw that in Baku. That was a driver who was like, you know what, I've got points proof here. And he might finish second and he won't challenge Lando for the win. But he's gonna finish a second behind him. Each time. He's gonna be right there going, you know what? I could have beaten Lando today. I didn't because of the championship, because of the team, so on and so forth. But I want you to know that I know I can match this guy. So there is a wider kind of picture at play here within McLaren for the rest of the season. Ultimately, I think Oscar will play ball because he is that kind of character, but he will be making a point, and it's just how much that point he's making can also advantage Lando.
A question for both of you, and I'll let Ian go first. Given everything we've just discussed, with 6 races remaining across an 8-week period, both titles being on the line, Red Bull and Max leading one, McLaren leading the other, which team has the most pressure? Is it McLaren or is it Red Bull?
I would say Red Bull. Are we talking about both titles?
In general, which team has the most pressure?
Red Bull. Because as I mentioned in my previous answer, they have to get it right towards the back end of this season. Otherwise, they're going to be fighting an uphill battle throughout 2025 as well.
Yeah.
Regardless of what's coming in 26, let's push that to one side for now for the sake of this argument. But, you've got to get it right at this stage. And that's why we're going to see so many teams coming with relatively major upgrades for this United States Grand Prix. Because if they can get it right here, then obviously then they're looking good for the rest of this season, and then they're going to feel themselves relatively confident going into next year. Right now, McLaren has it right. It has got that car in a specific window, at which I've, again, already mentioned that it can operate at pretty much every Grand Prix circuit that we've seen so far, especially those 4 very different type of circuits. And Azerbaijan and Singapore, yes, might be street tracks, but they are still very different. They have their own anomalies, own quirks that make them different. Whereas Red Bull, as we've discussed, really struggling to maximise that car as it stands at the moment. So that package, whatever goes on that Red Bull for the United States Grand Prix, is going to be absolutely crucial to not only that race, the 5 that follow, and for 2025. So for me, there is greater pressure on that team to get back up into that fight on a more regular basis with McLaren, rather than finishing 20 seconds behind Lando Norris as it did in Singapore. Whereas McLaren, they're in a good window. They've got 2 good drivers that they know can both be up there, both at the front of the grid on qualifying and on race day. Whereas, as we've seen with Red Bull, it has one driver predominantly that's near enough, always at the front, and the other one somewhere around midfield the majority of the time. So that is another topic I know we're going to get on. Checo Perez for 2025 and Liam Lawson, the 6th Grand Prix. It's going to be a good one to discuss. But for me, bottom line, it's all on Red Bull.
Sam, do you agree?
Yes and no. I think there's different types of pressure across both championships. Honestly, I think at this stage, Red Bull has almost ceded the Constructors' Championship. They, as I said before about Sergio, it's such a question mark week in, week out, what level of performance he's going to bring. And to close that 41-point deficit when you don't have the car doesn't have the performance on the table that the McLaren already does, it's almost akin to would you rather have those 3 points or have be get a draw and be ahead in football, or have that game in hand? The team with the game in hand ultimately still has that pressure. Red Bull has to deliver that performance to be in with a shout. So I think that's not going to happen necessarily in the Constructors' Championship. And I think Red Bull know that, because they don't have Sergio Perez operating at the level they need him to, whereas McLaren has two guys who are at that level. So I don't think there's the same pressure there. I think for McLaren, it's kind of now a case of, when it comes to the constructors, don't mess it up. You've got this. All you need to do is see it out. So I think there's pressure there. When it comes to the Drivers' Championship, absolutely, I completely agree. It is all on Red Bull and Max Verstappen. They've got the advantage. They themselves need to see it out. When all is said and done, there will be lots that people kind of pinpoint as the moment where things were won or lost. Hungary, the Italian Grand Prix, so on and so forth. But ultimately, when it comes to the Drivers' Championship, it's that first 4 or 5 rounds. That was the difference. Red Bull have done enough early in the season to give Max this advantage. Now there's a lot of pressure for them to see that through. And if they don't, there's no real excuse for that, given how much the lead was that early in the season.
Definitely. And of course, for those who are watching this podcast on YouTube, let us know your thoughts on anything we discussed so far in the comment section below. And if you're listening, hop over to YouTube when you get a chance and let us know your thoughts as well. Nothing's stopping you. We'd like to know what you want to think of our podcast. You've both mentioned there Liam Lawson, so let's do that now. I was going to save it for the end, but you've both jumped the gun, because it's a fascinating situation. Because effectively, Liam has 6 races to not only show that he deserves the RB seat alongside Yuki Tsunoda, it's also, in a way, it's an audition for Perez's seat in many cases, because if Liam excels, then it just gives Red Bull yet another headache, Ian.
For me, this is Liam auditioning for the Red Bull seat more than the RB seat, because what is he going to prove over this 6th Grand Prix that he didn't already prove in the 5 when he stood in for Daniel Ricciardo last season, to acquire that RB seat on a full-time basis? If they wanted Liam for next season, when they announced what they did last week, just after the Singapore Grand Prix, just getting confused with my dates there for a second, they might as well have turned around and said, 6th Grand Prix this season, and we'll give him a full season next season. Okay, they've got Isaac Hadja waiting in the wings, doing brilliantly in F2 this season, as we know. They got Arvid Lindblad coming through F3, but he's still at least another year away yet, because I do think that he needs that F2 drive first before Red Bull would even consider popping him into the RB seat alongside Yuki Tsunoda for 25. Isaac's front runner of those two, quite obviously. So for me, this is Liam auditioning 6th Grand Prix to see whether he's good enough to be alongside Sergio Perez. To be alongside Max Verstappen next year and replace Sergio Perez without a shadow of a doubt. For all the reasons I've just explained, doesn't make any sense that you just give him this 6 races and think, what should we do? Is he still worthy of the RB seat or not? He's already shown he is. That's why he's got the drive now. That's why he's had to wait so long, because Red Bull, RB decided to, and Red Bull family, of course, decided to give Daniel this opportunity to prove himself that he was the one to replace Sergio Perez. Helmut Marko has made that abundantly clear that that's what Daniel was there for, and he didn't. He was too inconsistent. His drives were, good drives were few and far between. And so that's why now they've taken this decision, give Liam this opportunity. So this is Liam auditioning, as I say, regardless of Sergio Perez's contract, the 1+1 that he signed in June. For me, this is him auditioning to be alongside Max for next season, or whether he's just going to stay in the RB seat alongside Yuki Tsunoda for another year.
And what's really interesting, Sam, is actually Checo, I think, is clearly aware of the rumours, given that there were some rumours as well that he was potentially going to announce his retirement in Mexico, which he brilliantly silenced on social media by using the Wolf of Wall Street. But it kind of shows that even with Ricciardo now out of the picture, with Liam now in, there is still this massive spotlight around Checo. And actually, he also still needs to perform across these remaining 6 races, not just to help Max, but actually to save his own seat, despite the fact he does have this deal, which quite clearly Red Bull can get rid of him should they want to.
Absolutely. It's renewed the pressure in many ways. It hasn't alleviated it in any way at all, because Red Bull, contrary to what everyone's kind of saying and suggesting, your lineup's looking weak. Actually, how strong is your depth? They're saying, no, we've got a good bench here. We've got Liam Lawson, who's going to come in, and if he does well, your seat's at risk. At the least, he's going to be, as Ian rightly points out, in my view, he'll be in that RB next year. And then, if you don't perform, we'll put Liam alongside Max. We've got Isaac Hadjar waiting in the wings. Christian Horner himself has said, look, we've got a known quantity in Daniel Ricciardo, almost slightly leaving that door ajar that if needs be, they'll put Daniel back in the RB as a stopgap. I don't think they will. Yeah, as Ian shakes his head, no, I don't think they will either, because they've got Isaac Hadjar, and he has proven very well this season in F2. But I think what they're kind of saying to Sergio is, look, just because Daniel's gone, it doesn't now mean that you're safe and that Liam's in that RB seat, because again, Sergio has never really shown much interest in being swapped into the RB seat, and nor have Red Bull shown the interest in doing that. And I think that's where some of those retirement rumours and that speculation has gained momentum, is that it feels Red Bull or nothing for Sergio. But ultimately, I think the pressure is very much there. It's very much renewed. And it's just a case now where I think the likes of Isaac Hadjar is kind of sitting there waiting, going, come on, Liam, do a job for me here. Because otherwise, he'll be the reserve next season. And you could argue that he's done enough for a race seat. And as Ian points out, you've got Arvid Lindblad, who Christian Horner is very, very hot on. He keeps on mentioning how impressed he is. Completely circumventing the fact you've got Aimu Uwasa in the academy as well, who's been kind of shuffled out to Super Formula. So there's lots of depth there. There's lots of guys who have proven themselves in F2. Obviously, Arvid, they want to see in F2 first. But as we know, again, the rules around the FIA loosening the super license restrictions, or the age restrictions around the super license, was actually due to Arvid Lindblad, not Kimi Antonelli. So that says just how much Red Bull have faith in him to come through. But he's not Max Verstappen, and they're not going to Max Verstappen him into a seat at RB. So there's certainly depth there. And it's all on Sergio now to keep a level of performance up that they go, you know what, Liam's done well, but not well enough to make that change at this point.
This is definitely a talking point I think we're going to keep coming back to across the remaining 6 races, depending on how Liam does, but also how Checo does. I'm going to change the topic completely because we need to discuss Mercedes. Going into the summer break, we could not have spoken more highly about them. They went into the summer on the back of 3 wins across 4 races. Gunther Steiner, I go back to the episode we did with him, Ian, because we said about how amazing are Mercedes doing now. They seem to have bounced back, and Gunther kind of downplayed it a little bit, saying, they've done good, but it's McLaren who has the best understanding. And it almost feels like Gunther was bang on the money, because since the summer break, Mercedes have just fallen again quite extraordinarily. I don't think many of us saw that coming, because we all kind of thought going into the summer, okay, Mercedes are back. Now, we even spoke about them potentially being title outsiders almost, because they looked so good. But it's just all gone wrong once again for them.
A developmental wrong turn.
Yeah.
As I've mentioned, in a previous answer on this show, it just goes to show how extraordinary this season has been. And Mercedes, one of those cases in points that ordinarily when a team develops a car, it develops it on an upward trend. And yet here we are, we've had a team like Mercedes that seemed to be on that upward trend, won 3 out of the 4 Grand Prix just before the summer break. Yes, one of those was fortuitous, of course, with George Russell in Austria after the collision between Max and Lando. But the other 2 were very much on merit. And it did look at that particular stage going into the summer break that Mercedes was going to be the team to keep an eye on over this second half of the season. And whilst a real long shot for the any kind of constructors title bid, you felt that they would be in the mix and making it difficult for McLaren, Red Bull, and Ferrari, taking those points off those top players that were looking for those wins and podium places, etc. And yet they've just about scraped into the lower reaches of the top 10 for the most part across Grand Prix weekends, simply because it took a wrong developmental direction, which it is now trying to get out of, as we saw very specifically with Ferrari. And I might as well bring them into the mix as well, bearing in mind what they've done, so I'll draw parallels. With Ferrari, they introduced an upgrade at Imola. Brilliant, worked well. Then introduced a second upgrade in Spain that was meant to build on the back of the Imola package. Didn't work well. Ferrari has then had to go back on that package and redevelop again to try and get itself out of that hole. Pretty much Mercedes has done the same thing. It brought in a package, did well, developed on top of that, not worked. Now they're having, again, like Ferrari, to re-engineer their way out of it. And now they will also have a package in the United States Grand Prix that they hope will, again, thrust it back in towards that front of the pack contention. So completely, I've never known anything like this, a season like this, in all honesty, in all my experience, where teams have developed their cars, seemingly set off on a good trajectory, and all of a sudden got it so badly wrong as Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes have done over the course of this season. Just an extraordinary set of circumstances. And it's played into this great narrative that we've had this season, and it's played into the fact that we're coming into these 6 Grand Prix and we still don't know the destiny of either of these 2 titles, which is making our job's easier. It's making it so much more interesting for the fans, because F1 is interesting. You go into a Grand Prix weekend, you don't know who's going to win it for the most part. That's what we love about Formula One. That's what we really enjoy about this sport. You go into a weekend, you don't know who's going to put the car on pole. You don't know who's going to take the checkered flag at the end of it. That's the situation that for the most part we've got at the moment. And for me, it's absolutely brilliant.
It's remarkable just how fragile these regulations are, that just the smallest of upgrades can just completely destroy a performance growth almost. But with Mercedes, Sam, it's not only them now trying to get themselves back out of this hole after taking a step backwards after another upgrade. They've also got looming over them ever larger, race by race, the fact that Lewis is now just 6 races away from leaving Mercedes to go to Ferrari, something that Ian and I discussed brilliantly with Sir Jackie Stewart last week on the podcast. And I recommend to those who haven't already listened or watched that to go back and look at it, because it was a very, very special episode and a huge honour to be joined by Sir Jackie. But Sam, Lewis now, of course, he has the final 6 races across 8 weeks. They're going to come thick and fast, effectively. He's not going to have a lot of time to be thinking about now life without Mercedes. Almost that's perhaps what he might have been doing during this break, because it's a bit of time to collect his thoughts and think about the final push to the finish. But that's something else for Mercedes now to manage, because it's 6 races. They've got a car that they need to get back into the right window, not just for this year, but looking ahead to next year as well. And at the same time, manage the fact that Lewis's departure is now actually only a couple of months away.
I think in many ways, though, as you point out, that period of reflection has almost been over this break, right? Because you get into 6 races in 8 weeks and it's time to go to work. So the focus will very much remain on the car. And I think that's the wins that Lewis had earlier in the year are a blessing to that. There is now, I don't think, the same feeling of we need to go out on a high. That high has come. That's those final wins, which, they may win again in the final 6 rounds. So can't count that out. They have a new floor coming in Austin to correct the flaw that they went wrong that Ian was alluding to before. Again, building on that trend of this season. I think the pressure is somewhat off because of those wins. They've had those beautiful moments. The British Grand Prix, paramount in that, was a wonderful, wonderful way to close this chapter in his career, in Mercedes' life in F1. And so in some ways is now turning towards 2025. Lewis is a consummate professional. He is going to be working to develop that car, even though any developments and any help and insight he provides might be to his detriment next year if they really get it right. So I think that it will almost just be a nice ease towards the end of the season when it comes to their relationship and everything they've achieved together. When all is said and done, they'll be able to look back and say, look, we got a couple of wins that final season, and it was a far better year in that sense than we've had since 2021. But ultimately, now is a case of let's build for tomorrow. We've seen how close this season has ended up being. 2025 is anyone's guess. George Russell, how is he going to lead that team? How much can we get from Lewis to advantage George and Kimi also next season? So I think it will really be a case of extracting the very last that they can from an all-time great before he then departs. And I think that will be the real kind of focus, as opposed to Lewis's legacy and their legacy together.
And what's really interesting, Ian, actually, is building on that. Is Lewis is kind of, it feels like, going from Mercedes to Ferrari, it's almost like the dynamics of Ferrari and Mercedes and how their season has gone is so similar, where they've both had these rises with upgrades and then downfalls with another upgrade. And it does feel like he's kind of stepping from one team to another, but he's almost entering the exact same situation, because Ferrari at the moment are kind of on, I don't want to say a high, because obviously Singapore, they should have finished much closer to McLaren. They obviously had good pace on the Friday, made mistakes in qualifying. We've seen across since the summer break that Ferrari has done well, particularly in Monza, obviously, with Charles Leclerc. There's also pressure on Ferrari now to build on from the last 4 races, and the car starting to perform better to ensure that they do go into 2025 on a high rather than on a low with another bad upgrade potentially.
That's why these final 6 races are so fascinating for so many different reasons, because of what is going to happen out of this season into next season. Yeah. Whereas previous winters, we know cars are developed heavily, changed considerably. Look at what Red Bull did from its 19 to its 20, just coming out of last season into this season, for argument's sake. But in this particular case, that's not going to happen, because the majority of the time and resources, once January the 1st starts and the teams know that they can then start looking at the 2026 car with integrating the new power unit into new aerodynamic regulations for that particular machinery, time, money, management predominantly will go into the 2026 car rather than the 2025 car. So whoever comes out of this season, as I've again previously mentioned, on a high is going to fare well, you would assume, across 2025. So Lewis Hamilton, yes, while he's got this 6th Grand Prix to enjoy, his last with Mercedes, he is going to be so focused on just what that Ferrari is doing, just down the pit lane from him, looking at its performance, seeing the trajectory it's on, and hoping for his sake going into his first season with the Scuderia in 2025, that the trajectory it's on at the minute, which is like that, does continue to go like that over this final 6 Grand Prix. Because if that's the case, then he knows he's going to have a good car for 2025, and he's going to make a reasonable fist of A, winning Grand Prix with the Scuderia, but B, maybe even challenging for that elusive record-breaking 8th world title. Again, just another fascinating strand to the conclusion of this season. So much going on, which what makes it so interesting for all of us concerned, both involved in the sport in terms of journalists, but also for all you fans out there listening, watching. I'm sure for many neutrals, regardless of who you support, you're looking at this and thinking, this is a good season. We've got a good season going on. And it's just so, again, I'll use the word fascinating to see how it's all going to play out, as I say, because so much of this season will carry over into 25.
So finishing things off, though, you mentioned 2026 at the start of that answering, and we've got to mention, obviously, some fairly big news that's obviously happened recently regarding 2026, and of course it surrounds Alpine, but more importantly, Renault, obviously, its engine. Partner Renault confirming that it will be ending its F1 engine program from 2026. In my opinion, quite a big blow. Renault have been around in F1 as an engine powertrain supplier for many a years. It kind of seen as one of the big three alongside Ferrari and Mercedes in terms of history and longevity. And I'll let you two decide who wants to answer it, because it's quite clear that that the staff behind the engine aren't happy with the decision. But it's sad, I think, more than anything, despite the fact that Alpine, okay, yes, might become more competitive as a customer team, who knows? But I think more importantly, it's F1 losing a manufacturer.
It is sad, and it is also a blow for F1, as well as it is for Renault and all the staff who are understandably discontent with this decision, because it's essentially saying this is so expensive and we don't quite feel that there's the payoff that's, that we want to see from doing this. So we're gonna cut this project that we've already started. We've already ploughed money into. It's still cheaper to cut ties at this stage now. So that's not a good look, especially when it cuts against what has been a very positive step and a very positive narrative around the direction of the power units in terms of at least the number of manufacturers that we're going to see come 2026. Say what you want about how complicated those power units are and will continue to be, and why that might be raising those costs, because there are things that are definitely questionable around those regulations, what that then means for the aerodynamics and how complex they are looking like they're going to be. But it's also, in some ways, it's sad, it's a bold move, but it is also brave for Alpine or Renault to make this decision. They are ultimately saying we want to be competitive, and we have to hold our hands up and say that this isn't the best way for us to be competitive at this stage. I think the jury is going to remain out for a while as to whether or not they will come to regret this decision, because giving away work status is a huge move, an unprecedented move as far as I'm aware. It's really a damning signal that they're sending. So it's only just beginning, this story, this narrative. There's got a lot to unravel with this. And ultimately, we're not really going to see actually how good a choice that is until 2026, when we know who their partner will be and actually how competitive the chassis that they deliver is as well.
And of course, before this announcement was made, Ian, you actually in Monza went and saw those who were protesting, obviously not wanting this to happen. You obviously got to spend a bit of time with them. And so I'll let you bring us home on this, because it is sad, and not just obviously for F1 to be losing Renault's manufacturer, but also for the people who have put so much blood, sweat and tears into ensuring that Alpine are a manufacturer team, a works team, not a customer, which is obviously what they're going to be from 2026. Because as Sam mentioned, that is a pretty unprecedented change in F1. It's a massive switch.
Yeah, 1977, Renault entered F1, and by the time it exits at the end of next season, it would have been in F1 for 49 years, bar a couple of seasons in the 80s, where it was either a constructor in its own right, or, as you've pointed out, an engine manufacturer, which it has predominantly been. So, you got to feel for the staff at Viry-Châtillon, 300 plus staff there that have, they've spent a considerable amount of time and resource already in developing the 2026 power unit. And pretty much they're not drawing towards the end of this project, 15 months to go until 26 rolls along, and they've decided to sever all ties with F1 effectively as Renault. So yes, there is a degree of sadness in that respect, given Renault's longevity in the sport. But again, this is just the key aspect here is that 2026 was meant to attract new power unit manufacturers. We're getting a different type of engine. It was meant to draw new blood in. We've got Honda coming back, of course. Obviously, Ford are playing its role with Red Bull. And yet we've got one of the biggest names in global manufacturing deciding to pull out. How that must sit within Formula One. I'd love to get a penny for Stefano Domenicali's true thoughts on it, rather than those that I could simply ask him in an interview with him, because I can imagine it'd be very, very different. I can't imagine he would be best pleased. But look at what Alpine will probably be thinking. Well, look at what McLaren has achieved with a Mercedes engine in the back. It's outperforming the works team. We could do that, and then it all comes down to the development of the car around the power unit. But of course, this is again Renault taking a major gamble, because whilst we are 90+% certain that it's going to be a Mercedes power unit in the back of that Alpine from 26 onwards, who's to say Mercedes is going to be the manufacturer that again is going to be that leap ahead of its rivals, as it was with the introduction of the current power unit era that came into force from 2014 onwards, and where Mercedes just wiped the floor with everybody for a good few years before its rivals started to play catch up. It's a hell of a gamble that they're taking, because there are simply no guarantees.
And of course, that's a great question for our audience. Do you think it's a gamble that will pay off? Let us know in the comment section on YouTube. And I think that is a perfect point to end this week's episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast. From Sam, Ian, and myself, we will see you same time next week for the next episode. See you later.
And as always, take care, folks.
Thanks for joining us.